Hello, and welcome to the Full Scottish. My name is Seán Pieper, and my guests today are Professor Murray Pittock, Bradley Professor of Literature and Pro-Vice Principal of the University of Glasgow, and Hugh Marshall, the founder of Talking Wales, an independent digital news service launching later this year. Welcome both of you to the programme.
Thanks, Seán.
We begin with an update from the conflict in Ukraine, day 802. Russian attacks on Ukraine's Kharkiv and Dnipro regions and the Black Sea city port of Odessa have killed at least 2 civilians, injured others, and damaged critical infrastructure, homes, and commercial buildings, regional officials said on Saturday. Oleh Syniehubov, governor of Kharkiv region, said that Russian shelling had killed a 49-year-old man on the street near his home in Shobozadze village. A Russian missile attack started a fire on a civilian enterprise in an industrial district of Kharkiv city, injuring 6 employees, he added. In the south, 3 people were injured in Odessa city by a missile strike, said the regional governor, Oleh Pieper. The reports of Russian attacks came after the Ukrainian Air Force said overnight that Russia had launched 13 Shahed drones towards the Kharkiv and Dnipro regions. All were downed by air defences, the Air Force commander added. However, falling debris injured 4 people and sparked a fire in an office building. On Sunday, the Air Force said that Ukrainian defence systems destroyed 23 of 24 attack drones Russia launched against Ukrainian territory. In his nightly video address, Volodymyr Zelensky said that Ukrainian forces shot down a Russian Su-25 fighter bomber over the Donetsk region in eastern Ukraine on Saturday. In the industrial region of Dnipropetrovsk, shelling injured a 57-year-old woman and damaged infrastructure in Nikopol near the Russian-held Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, regional governor Serhiy Lysak said. Drone footage has shown the Ukrainian village of Okhterinye in eastern Ukraine's Donetsk region being battered by fighting. Russian troops have been advancing in the area, pounding Kyiv's depleted, ammunition-deprived forces with artillery, drones and bombs. Ukraine's military has acknowledged that Russia has gained a foothold in Okhterinye, which has a population of about 3,000 before the war, but says the fighting there is continuing. Residents have fled the village, among them a 98-year-old woman who walked almost 10 kilometres wearing a pair of slippers and supported on a cane until she reached the Ukrainian front lines. Russia has opened a criminal case against Volodymyr Zelensky and put him on a wanted list, the state news agency TASS reported on Saturday, an announcement Ukraine dismissed as evidence of Moscow's desperation. Ukraine's foreign ministry noted that Russia's president, Vladimir Putin, was subject to an arrest under an international criminal court warrant. China's president, Xi Jinping, heads to Paris today for a rare visit, with his French counterpart, Emmanuel Macron, set to press him to reduce trade imbalances and try to convince him to use his influence on Russia over the war in Ukraine. And Western politicians and diplomats have called for a halt to spiralling violence in Georgia after security forces used water cannon, tear gas, stun grenades and rubber bullets to break up a peaceful rally against the proposed foreign influence bill. The EU, which has granted Georgia candidate status, strongly condemned the violence and called on the government to respect the right to peaceful assembly. Now, the current situation with the protests in Georgia put me very clearly in mind of the situation in Ukraine around the beginning of the Maidan protest, the situation there where a particularly young populace was looking to move closer to the EU while the president at the time was reaffirming links and ties with Russia. I wonder what each of you thinks in regards to this, whether actually we can expect to see more cases like this, in Georgia currently, but perhaps all around the sort of the post-Soviet area, and that this is perhaps a sort of a concerted strategy being employed by the Russian government. So if I could just turn to you first, Murray, in regards to that.
Well, I think the Russian Federation has always sought to control its near abroad, as it would put it, and there's no change there in terms of what's happening indirectly in Georgia and what happened directly in Georgia in 2008. So this is very much textbook stuff. I think the initial concerns of the Georgian government are around the governance requirements and the requirements on transparency in business and governance practices, which EU candidate status would demand of Georgia, and which, of course, since there's a large element of oligarchic control, they wouldn't actually want to. The government wouldn't actually want to implement. But I don't think, although Georgia's a lot further off from the EU and doesn't benefit from the contiguity of trade from which Ukraine would benefit. Nonetheless, I don't think the analogy with the Maidan protests is completely inappropriate at all. That's roughly what's happening, and we're seeing a prolonged struggle which has been going on for just about 20 years now between Putin's increasingly authoritarian, and the authoritarianism ratchets up every few years, regime in the Russian Federation and the post-Soviet republics seeking to break free of all Russian Federation influence, with the exception of parallel dictators such as that in Belarus, and indeed the Georgian government. There isn't a great deal of enthusiasm on a mass level for remaining part of the Russian Federation's extended sphere of influence.
Is there anything you'd like to add in regards to that, Hugh? Obviously, the perspectives here in relationship to EU membership have been divisive, have been tested since and in the run up to the Brexit referendum. But obviously, seeing the relationship to potential EU membership on the fringes of Europe is a whole different matter. So I always think it puts it in a very interesting perspective what membership of the EU means depending on your sort of geographical location. But yeah, if there's anything you'd like to add.
Yeah, I think it's interesting just the actual location of Georgia, because obviously it's got Russia to the north and Turkey to the south, and it's also it's in very close proximity to Iran and Iraq. I think we forget how sort of as a location, it's in a really interesting historical location. The fact it's on the Black Sea. Which is and it's quite near to Ukraine. So it's interesting how that from the EU perspective, you've got Ukraine, you've got Turkey, and then you've got obviously sort of Georgia, Azerbaijan. I think is slightly further over to the other side. But yeah, because it doesn't actually sort of fit in with what we think of a traditional EU country. But I think what you said earlier. Younger people have a different perspective on life, and I think this is the big challenge, and I think that's the challenge that Putin is going to face. Is he's not getting any younger, and I think even though obviously it's a dictatorship in Russia, I would imagine younger people with access to the world via the internet probably do share a different worldview.
Well, absolutely. I've certainly been struck by the sort of generational divides that have been opened up within Russia. How many young people have left, whether to directly avoid conscription or simply because they see sort of their life chances being eroded. But I think that's absolutely right. That we need to think what the future of Russia will be also after Putin. He won't be here forever.
But I think we need to be realistic here too, because one of the most disturbing things I think is that the pressure on the Soviet Union to quit Afghanistan in the late 1980s on the basis of about 50 or 60,000 deaths coming from families, mothers in particular, of soldiers who've been killed in Afghanistan was quite substantial. But we seem to be dealing with casualty rates and death rates in Ukraine, which are several times higher than the total casualty rates in Afghanistan. And the pressure doesn't seem to be there. I'm not saying it's completely absent, but frankly, it is remarkable that a society, even an authoritarian society, is prepared to put up with half a million dead and wounded, or possibly more, with the lack of fundamental protest that we see in the Russian Federation. I mean, I'm not an optimist in this one. The Russian Federation Putin represents a big section of opinion in the Russian Federation. The Russian Federation really believes, a lot of people in it believe, that they are entitled to seize other people's land if they regard it as historically Russian. And that is not something that they really changed their minds about since the 17th or 18th century. So I'm on the more skeptical side. Not to deny there are many liberal young people in places like Moscow and St. Petersburg, or were before they left the Russian Federation, they could. But there is an enormous well of support for aggressive and brutal military intervention among the population of the Russian Federation. I think we have to remember that.
Well, that's an excellent point. Absolutely, we're also forgetting to understand the Russian perspective, which also goes back to the time of the Soviet Union, as you say, has its roots far before that in the Russian psyche. But as you say, also to not underestimate the fact that Putin has also managed to stay in power because he is able to foster a base and nurture a base. No, that's very very worthwhile pointing out. Now, turning from Ukraine to the situation in Gaza, the death toll, according to the Gaza Health Ministry, has now reached 34,654, with an approximate 77,908 people injured. What we've also seen is growing waves of protest again all around the world, taking on various forms and with equally various goals in mind. Major anti-government protests in Israel, in Tel Aviv. Obviously, the very highly covered US campus protests, which have been, in part violently suppressed, but have been popping up even more so in response to this, and also with solidarity protests and encampments appearing across Europe and in other countries across the world. And what we also have still, despite the hostile media coverage and the, I would say in large part demonization that many of these protests and protesters have faced, a continuing protest movement here in the UK. I'm curious as to reactions from both of you, what you think, out with the sort of the locus of the conflict in Gaza, in Palestine, what each of you think the legacy of these events will ultimately be here in America, on the West, if we want to call it that in this context. I'm very much struck by the parallels, certainly with what's happening in the US now with the protests against the Vietnam War, and I'm wondering whether this has that sort of scale or impact, not just on politics, but on culture and on society more widely. If I start with you again, Murray, if that's all right.
Okay. Well, again, I may be a little bit more on the skeptical side here. So there are mass protests, but one must be careful about how far those protests are representative. And one of the straws in the wind there was in Columbia, which is one of the most affected campuses in the US. A Jewish student has just been elected student president. So we are not necessarily seeing the kind of scale of campus protest that characterized the latter years of the Vietnam War. And I think we are also seeing protest which is very widespread. I think it reminds me far more of the BLM protests in 2020-21 than it does the Vietnam War. Protests which are not necessarily particularly well informed or moderate. It's very noticeable that as with the peace talks currently being brokered in Cairo between Qatar and Egypt with Israel, very noticeable that many of the actual states in the Middle East have got a great deal more reservation about the Palestinian administration, particularly the Gazan administration, i.e. Hamas, because those figures, the health ministry in Gaza are Hamas figures so they are generated in Hamas's interest, which is not to say there haven't been enormous casualties in Gaza. There have, but we have to be realistic. We have to be realistic and careful that actually protests in favor of a two-state solution, protests in favor of a long-term settlement, many of these are not. These are effectively pro-Hamas protests, and they take the Hamas line. And that's something which I think reflects the fact that a lot of people are not particularly well informed about the complex issues that exist in the Israel-Palestine conflict. So, in terms of the long-term legacy, I think one of the things we're seeing here is I would say it's very worrying. Parts of this are very worrying right now, but there isn't a long-term legacy except that very clearly highly partisan and social media accelerated protests are internationally spreading in particular areas where there is a trigger event or conflict, and that we would like to see more of this. I remember particularly seeing in Scotland two rather portly police Scotland officers policing a BLM demonstration, and someone coming up to them putting a placard in their face saying that they were killers. Well, the link between Police Scotland and some of the actions of the US police forces is rather a remote one, I think. But the issue is that people don't see context. They have a simple view, and this simple view spreads globally, and it leads to huge numbers of flash protests with varying degrees of support. And that's, I think, what we're seeing now. It happens to be a very big one because, of course, the extent of atrocities being carried out by the IDF in Gaza are substantial. But the real legacy, the real longer term legacy, is what is the legacy in the Middle East, because it looks as if, in my view anyway, the October attacks by Hamas were designed to create an entire population of martyrs on the Gaza Strip, which the IDF have obliged by providing them with.
And Hugh, how would you sort of conceptualize what we're seeing at the moment in terms of the situation here in the UK, in terms of also the kind of the push to end UK arms sales to Israel? That's sort of, as Murray has said, the protests, particularly protests that go worldwide, can often end up being sort of diffuse and dislocated from their sort of original context. But this is something that is very directly linked to the political situation in the UK.
Yeah, we've had protests in Wales. We've had people actually arrested outside factories in Wrexham up in the north that are sort of part of the arms manufacturing network that have got links to Israel. What was interesting, 3 who were up in court last week were actually found not guilty. So I would disagree with the fact that that the protests are being seen as pro Hamas. I'm not seeing much of that. I'm not saying that that there isn't. Clearly, we've seen in some of the London protests some of the people who've been arrested with placards and some of the slogans. But I think in general, I think people do realise that that what Israel, not just what they're doing in Gaza, but just what historically what they've been doing, is it is a version of apartheid. We saw what happened in South Africa with apartheid, and it was thankfully sort of consigned to history. But I think it is a very complex situation. So Israel have got themselves in a situation where in Netanyahu is somebody who is basically fighting for his political skin to and he doesn't want to be seen as being weak because obviously there are the extreme right-wing elements within his sort of cabinet and are sort of keeping him in power. And I think he's trying to keep those people on board. while America and the West are trying to pressurise him into accepting that. But I think in general, I think people do see that Hamas are as much of a problem as Netanyahu is. And I think, if we do have a two-state solution, it needs to be something that the people of Gaza and the Palestinians have a say in. But, as I say, it is difficult when you have got Hamas, who are, a terrorist organisation. And, the fact that people like the PLO have been pushed out, and, sort of the more moderate elements of, the Palestinians haven't got that political voice. And, obviously you've got Iran in the mix as well, who obviously it's in their interest to provoke these things. But yeah, it's clear Hamas, what they did on October 7th was despicable, but it was, done for a reason. And I think, that Israel have given them what they wanted, but it's ended up with thousands of people losing their lives. And I think, when we look at the numbers, I know people sort of, suggest that it's the Hamas, sort of health authority that are providing numbers. The United Nations, they've got a list of names. So I think, probably the estimates of the numbers are probably lower than they actually are, because, a lot of people are still unaccounted for.
Well, yeah, particularly with the scale of destruction in the urban centres in Gaza, it will take months to know the true death toll. Turning from the international to the more domestic, i.e. the English local elections, the Conservatives currently are down 396 seats, with Labour up 231. I'm curious as to sort of your initial general reaction to these results. It seems to be an unambiguously bad time for the Conservatives, and obviously people are seeing a significant swing to Labour. But I think within that there is more nuance to be found. So I'll start with you this time, Hugh. Just what your general reaction to the election we've seen is.
Yeah, it's clearly been sort of disaster for the Conservatives. I'm just looking at the latest website, and I think this is based on 106 of the 107 councils that have declared. So the Conservatives, started off with around 1,000 councillors in this round of elections. Obviously, it wasn't across the whole of, where the elections were held, and they've lost almost half, 473. But I think what's interesting is Labour have only picked up around 10%. And I think that, the big winners in this are, the Lib Dems, the Greens, and the Independents. Because I think what it sees is obviously the Conservatives are imploding, but Labour aren't sort of benefiting hugely from that implosion. I think there is, basically people have had enough for the Conservatives, but what are the alternatives? And I don't think Labour can come out of this, with obviously, the mayoral results that they've won, those are good results for them. But at the end of the day, with the state of the Conservative Party as it is at the moment, the Conservatives shouldn't be winning anyway. They shouldn't be winning anything. They're the easiest targets to defeat. So, the fact that the King, that they only just won, with some of the mayoral elections, speaks volumes. But when you see people like Rotherham in Merseyside and Andy Burnham in Manchester, who did win with large, sort of mandates, and it shows that there are progressive elements within the Labour Party who have a popular and have a vision and actually want to do things. The quote I heard from Starmer overnight on the BBC sort of website was, "This is a changed party." He'll be telling us next that his father worked in a factory. It's just one message. It's just this. I'm not Corbyn. We're changed. You can trust us, but we're not seeing any vision from them. And it was interesting. I watched Laura Koonsberg's programme this morning out of interest, because she tweeted on Friday that rumours are coming around that London was going to be tight, and the Conservatives running them close, which is absolute nonsense. And it was shown afterwards that there was actually a swing from the Conservatives to Labour, and it was interesting that Koonsberg didn't take the opportunity this morning to correct what she'd stated. But again, she raised the point of Reform running, it's a large number of candidates. Reform only stood 340 candidates, and they only won 2 seats. So the fact that, they're being mentioned, yes, the Greens and the Lib Dems are getting mentioned, but they're being mentioned in the same breath as Reform, where in reality, Reform have done absolutely nothing. We want to be hearing more about the Greens, more about the Lib Dems, and I want to hear more about what Labour actually want to actually do.
Well, exactly as you said, the Reform Party has been receiving a lot of coverage in regards to these elections when, actually perhaps it's the Greens and the Lib Dems and the Independents that should really be drawing more attention. What are your thoughts on the takeaways from this election, Murray?
Well, they're not dissimilar from as far as the local elections go. On the seats that were up, the Conservatives lost just almost half their seats. The Greens and the Lib Dems took a much more. Lib Dems, in fact, second in the seats that were contested in the final results. They took a larger chunk of the seats than you might necessarily have expected, but the polling projections that saw Labour short of an overall majority on these numbers need to be treated with a great deal of caution, both because of the limited nature of the number of seats up for grabs, the slightly different pattern in local elections, the much more significant presence, an enhanced presence, in fact, of independents and so on. So I think, possibly the Conservatives did slightly better than you would think. But it's interesting that those who did best, Houchen, who was returned, and Street, who almost made it in the West Midlands, are actually people who, as mayors, have prioritised getting things done for their communities and things that work. Because what people are really sick of from politicians of all stamps is the overdeveloped policy news cycle where things keep on being announced or indeed recycled to be announced and nothing gets done and nothing works. So I think the lesson to be taken away was that the Tories did not suffer nearly so badly where they had governance on the ground that prioritised what people want and getting it done, and that was in the West Midlands. Though admittedly they did lose on the overall swing and in Tees.
I think that's a very good point, and also I think you could potentially see some of the parallels between, say, the performance of Ben Houchen in this election, and also the strong performance of someone like Andy Burnham for Labour. Someone who himself also often ends up challenging the leadership or the sort of the party organisation a bit more than other candidates, and is perhaps better regarded for it. That's the thing, though, in terms of. On the back of Labour's performance, they very much look like an incumbent government, which will make the sort of perhaps lack of policy, or at least the lack of willingness to clearly communicate policy, other than laying out what they're not planning to spend money on, is going to be even more difficult to avoid. As you said, Hugh, you would like to hear more about what they actually intend, but the question is whether actually all we're going to see up until a general election is more of what essentially feels like obfuscating, which unfortunately is passing by simply because of how dire the situation of the Conservative Party is.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting is, from a Welsh perspective, because, obviously one of the is the 5 missions, that Starmer talks about. One of them is the health service, and I heard Starmer this week. Obviously, we'll be discussing it later on. About Scotland being in chaos, and the NHS waiting lists being where they are. Well, the worst performing NHS in the UK is in Wales, where waiting lists are longer than they are in Scotland by a fair distance. And guess who's been running the health service in Wales for the last 20 years? The Labour Party. So, it's one thing, that they can pick and choose and say that they're going to do these things. But, what we've seen in Wales is, when they're actually given the job of actually running things, they're not doing it. Interesting. This morning, Conservative commentating about education in England. And it's fair to say, so educational standards in England, are higher than they are in Wales and Scotland. But Wales is right at the bottom of the list. And again, it's a devolved competence, and it's been run by Labour. So it's quite interesting where you have started on one hand trying to, attack other parties in, where they've actually got responsibility to do it, but where they have got responsibility in the UK over education and health, they're doing a worse job of anybody. So, it's interesting, and I think the media need to pick up Starmer more about what's going on with Labour in Wales, and actually challenge them on those performances.
I think in this context, that's why also the Welsh view is so invaluable, simply because, with Labour having been in opposition both in Scotland and in England for so long, to actually hold them to account for what they are doing, what they are attempting to achieve, or what they are in fact failing to achieve, as the case may be. Now, this week saw Rishi Sunak beginning a sort of blitz drive towards the Rwanda deportations, announcing that people would begin to be lifted throughout the week, and inevitably also then sparking a backlash. Obviously, in previous years, we saw protests here in Glasgow, such as at Kenmure Street, which blocked asylum seekers from being deported, and we've seen the same happening in response to these raids this week. The question is, the Rwanda policy, yes, it has now passed into law. It is staying divisive and difficult, with its overall scope remaining very unclear. I also can't help but wonder whether, in the current climate of widespread protest, whether announcing these raids very publicly, making them into a sort of a policy platform, whether actually also part of the aim is to elicit a response, is to kind of potentially sow further division on the issue of immigration in this instance. How, Murray, would you reflect on the kind of the overall state of where this Rwanda policy is currently, and on what sort of an impact it's having on the debate around immigration and asylum?
Well, so it's there's no question that the Rwanda policy, whatever it is not only dreadful in its optics about human rights, but is also very doubtful as to the amount that it costs per asylum seeker who can be placed in Rwanda. I mean, I understand that the initial accommodation in Rwanda is only in the low hundreds, though the Conservative government do keep on suggesting that thousands and thousands will be able to be sent for the £500 million plus that they are spending on this approach. But at the same time, UK-wide, and that of course predominantly means by English voters, the polling evidence does seem to show, certainly in recent months, that the Rwanda policy is popular and that a majority of people support it. So once again, I think one has to take into account that the British government are doing very expensively and very aggressively something which a large number of citizens seem to want, which is not necessarily something we find pleasant to contemplate, but is the reality in front of us. That said, obviously there were quite a few protests this week, and I think only something like I don't know how many were finally rounded up, if that's not too offensive a phrase by the Home Office, but I think they can only trace 40% of the 5,700 that they were intending to lay hands on. Of course, there were significant local protests in places like Peckham and indeed in Margate in Kent, which is historically seen as Kent's always seen as a very anti-immigrant area. And indeed in the Margate case, something like 3/4 of those who were to be moved were subsequently told they would not be moved as a consequence, it seems, of the protest. So it's clearly not particularly efficiently carried out. It's getting local protests. It's an extraordinarily expensive way, as well as a way offensive to many people, to deal with issues of asylum seeking. In every sense, it's impractical and strange and perverse as a public policy, but it is a public policy that seems to command substantial support. And I think we really need to consider where we are, where the United Kingdom is as a whole, on the immigration question and the lack of understanding of the benefits, not least in taxation revenue and ambition in dynamism, that immigrants bring to society, as well as the challenges that integration of immigrants offers.
Well, that's it. In terms of the way the debate is often framed, there is this sort of almost foregone conclusion that immigration is bad and is damaging to the people of the UK. Whereas absolutely there needs to be a more nuanced, more varied debate around that, and also for communities here that have immigrated, to for them also to be able to sort of demonstrate their place within society, demonstrate what they bring to it. What you were saying about the cost of the policy, obviously that's the aspect of this that has been sort of most directly criticised by Labour. The failure to deliver it effectively and the delivery of it at such high cost. That doesn't make it clear that necessarily an incumbent Labour government would end this policy, or even would significantly change it, particularly if, as you say, they can see that there is a sort of, particularly in England, a sort of groundswell of support for it, or at least a support for stopping the boats, which is obviously a more nuanced way of portraying the issue. If I could turn back to you, Hugh, in terms of how the reaction has been in Wales. Obviously, I'm very interested to keep getting your sort of perspective for us, but it's not something that we hear so much in terms of this debate. The immigration debate is often defined very much by the south of England, the Channel, the small boats, etc.
Yeah, I think it is something that, again, one of the reasons it's used as one of the main policies is that it sort of it lights certain people's fires. It is something that the people we think that people sort of care about. But what's interesting, because this is something I've been looking at the polling about this, and it was true that there was a majority in favour of the policy, but YouGov, who've been tracking this, I was just looking at their most recent one, and it's actually the majority now is that the people want to see the policy scrapped altogether. So 40% want it scrapped, 20% want it to go, to be as it is, 70% want it to be adapted, with 23% don't knows, and that's a survey of 3,000 people. So it's clearly a shift now that people are actually seeing, the cost and how it actually works or doesn't work. Then people are changing their minds on it. And I think, in fairness to the Labour Party, I think it was Pat McFadden was on Laura Kuenssberg, and even though what's interesting is, as you mentioned, Labour aren't saying that they're against the policy because it's inhumane and awful and should never have been considered in the first place. It's because of the cost. But they have said that they wouldn't continue with it, and they would use the money to stop the boats. Their plan is to sort of not spend money on this, which is basically a vanity project for the Conservatives, but spend that money in Europe on work, trying to sort of close down the gangs who are responsible for this. But I think immigration is one of those things. It was one of the things that drove Brexit. And sadly Wales did vote by a narrow majority of about 80,000 to for Brexit, and a big part of that was immigration. I spoke to people on the street here where I live in an ex-coal mining valley in Wales, and people were voting because they wanted, to stop immigration. But when I was saying to them, well, what immigration? When you look around you, because the only people who are immigrants within, the valley here are people who run sort of the local takeaway businesses. And obviously the answer then was, oh yeah, but they're different. So there's obviously a certain type of immigrants that, that people try and sort of drive anger against. And I think what's interesting, you look at the London mayoral elections, you've got two parties who, who put themselves, you've got Britain First, who are, the ultimate sort of anti-immigrant, Britain is a Christian white country, and who got less votes than Count Binface. And you've got Reform, who try and make a big deal of, obviously through Farage of immigration, and they got 3.2% of the vote. So when it does come down to people sort of fighting on almost like a single policy or as a core policy, it doesn't seem to be moving people's dials from an electoral perspective.
Well, that's it. Obviously these sort of culture war policies have been the absolute staple of the Tories in recent years. But what's notable is that when it actually comes down to, putting a cross in a box, when it comes down to an election, still the things that people care most about are, their economy, their local economy, their NHS, their schools, etc. It's mundane issues, and actually polling would suggest people don't enjoy sort of basing their whole politics on culture war issues. It's just because they are so often framed around these very emotive points or explicitly around wedge issues that that ends up hooking people into these debates. But absolutely,
it may be of relevance to what we're about to come on to, that actually it was a clear sign that identity politics doesn't cut it when it comes to the ballot box. It looks as if it might, but it really doesn't.
Well, that's it. There's a whole spectrum of what identity politics looks like as well. But turning to the political developments in Scotland, obviously it's been a pretty seismic week. We've had the resignation of Humza Yousaf as First Minister and SNP leader. We've had the potential of a leadership contest with that now sort of ebbing away into the background, it seems, with Kate Forbes saying that she will not be standing for leader, and it looking very much like John Swinney will now be the new SNP leader and the new First Minister of Scotland. Obviously quite major shifts, quite major things going on. Murray, if I could just have your overall reaction to what we've seen in the last couple of weeks, and what you think it actually tells us about the current situation in Scottish and UK politics, and perhaps also about the campaign for independence as well.
Well, how long have you got? Well, not long. So
we've got as long as we need. So this is
well, it could take. I mean, in brief, as I said to again, the then First Minister was concerned that Greens were as upset as they were. But if you sack somebody without warning and throw them straight in, they tend to get upset. Most people get upset if they're sacked without any notice, without any warning, and with immediate effect. So it was entirely possible if you threw the Greens out of the coalition, this would be the outcome. And it was also entirely predictable that they would line up in a confidence vote against the First Minister. So I have to say that last Friday demonstrated serious limitations on political management on the part of the First Minister, and that is why he is no longer in office. Because there were lots of ways to deal with the Greens, and I say deal with them because it was clear that the coalition was fraying at the seams and being in the Greens' in tray until their 7,500 members could decide to vote against continuing the coalition was not an ideal position for the Scottish National Party to be in. So the coalition had to end, but the manner of its ending was politically maladroit to the extent that it brought an end to the First Minister's career. And so that's what's happened in the last week. I think what, in terms of the independence movement, maybe we're moving on there to the new First Minister. But what probably does draw a line under is the extent of the prioritization or perceived prioritization of identity politics by the Scottish government, which it could be interpreted as its own form of domestic culture wars about separating people into the righteous and unrighteous, And in a situation where, frankly, just about half of people support Scottish independence, and now far fewer support the Scottish National Party, actually legislating to in a way which will alienate certain groups without satisfying other groups is not a strategy to get over 50%. It is a strategy to stay under 50% and to erode your own support. And that's what we've seen. And I think the departure of the Greens from government will lead to a move away from that emphasis, which has been, frankly, catastrophic for the Scottish National Party's support at a time when they could do with it. Because I mean, although there is time to recover before 2026, the general election will be severely damaging for the SNP in Scotland. I'm absolutely convinced of that, and there is very little time to find a way back. But that has been entirely predictable, and frankly, the MPs have been saying that to Holyrood for some time, but nonetheless without being listened to until this week.
I think that's a lot of interesting stuff to take away from that. Certainly, as you said, what is also been illustrated, and I think that I've certainly heard, particularly in the more London-orientated media, tying the fates of Scottish political leaders and the independence movement together. I think that is certainly not the case. As you said, support for independence is significantly higher than support for the SNP. Support for independence is still gradually growing. Support for the SNP fluctuates as it does for any political party. How would you sort of respond seeing events from Wales, perhaps seeing parallels, seeing challenges in the future for yourselves, or simply what it reflecting on the current state of sort of pro-independence movements within the UK?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. Obviously, the longer you're in power, the more challenging it gets to sort of maintain that power. And again, when you look at the parallels between Wales and Scotland, you've had Labour here who've been in power longer than the SNP. But what I found interesting, again, just going back to sort of the dialogue coming out of Labour about sort of needing a Scottish general election because the SNP have appointed sort of two leaders now without a vote. Well, Vaughan Gething was just selected by sort of Labour members as the First Minister, as was Mark Drakeford before him. So again, it's this sort of operating almost like in an insular way that they don't realise what's going on. But I agree, completely. I think Hamza Yousaf, just if you make a decision as you do, with the way that he acted with the Green Party, it was, it's just embarrassing. He had to go. There was no, and it shows, sadly, it's shown him for what a lot of people were saying before he was elected, as to his qualities of being able to be a leader of the country. And I think, having somebody like John Swinney, if it is Swinney who is chosen, I think it's, having somebody who is seen as, sensible, centre, and, who can sort of discuss things from a perspective, looking at the economy, looking at improving health and education, the things that people are interested in. And I think that's what bogged down, lots of these, with the SNP is that identity politics, that, other matters have taken priority, and they are important, and I'm not saying that they're not important, but at the end of the day, it's the economy, it's health and education. You've got to prioritise things, and people need to be able to see that those things are being handled well, and are improving. But I agree, it's going to be a challenge to the SNP in the Westminster elections, especially with an English media who are going to project this as a two-horse race between the Labour and Conservatives, going back to the local elections. The smaller parties, the independents, the Lib Dems and the Greens, will do better in local elections because people are voting on local matters. When it comes to Westminster, that's where the challenge is, and that's where we see in Wales with Plaid Cymru is, why vote for a nationalist party in Wales when if you only get a handful of MPs in Westminster. So no, I think it's interesting, but I think it'll be interesting to see what the polling will be for the SNP in the coming months. Now that Hamza Yousaf has gone, because I think unfortunately again he's been used as a target of the culture wars as well. We've got the far right, sort of the fact that you had Hamza Yousaf in Scotland, Sadiq Khan in London, you got the Prime Minister, and then you got Vaughan Gething in Cardiff, and it has been a target of the culture wars, and that's something that now will be less of an issue.
Yeah, and also with someone like John Swinney, who has quite a sort of a long established career, as you said, someone seen more in the centre, seen as quite sort of stable and competent. Is there anything you'd like to add on to that, Murray, in terms of sort of the broader picture, politically speaking?
Well, I mean, I think once, and it looks about absolute certainty now, that as close to a certainty as they can be in politics, John Swinney becomes First Minister. I think, he's already signalled a rather slimmed down government. If you remember, Alex Salmond came into government with only 7 members of the cabinet in 2007. And the growth of ministries with overlapping responsibilities is an issue that is clearly in John Swinney's sights. So you can expect that. You can expect a renewed focus on economic growth and development, and on policy which are good for the economy and address people's basic concerns over health and education and public provision as far as possible in in what is a difficult and challenging economic landscape. I think that will be the focus. And that ultimately, if we're talking about independence, if the SNP, whereas a Scottish government, wants to persuade people to vote for independence, the only way people will be persuaded to vote for independence is if they believe that the government which is recommending it to them is competent and focused on the basic matters that they care about, and that also that government is economically competent, is clearly taking action to support economic growth, and has a plan to secure economic growth and prosperity for whatever Scotland becomes if it were to become independent. And I think there's been every sign of a lot of people losing sight about that, seeing independence as some kind of, rather like Brexit, some kind of fantasy fulfillment of a sovereigntist fantasy, or else seeing it as just something which will deliver what they want to see from it. And actually, if it's a major and revolutionary and radical political project, but it is one which is anchored in the conventional things that people want. If people do not think that they're going to have an independent state which is going to be normal, competent and prosperous, and more competent and prosperous than it would be in the United Kingdom, they are not going to support it. And that sounds incredibly basic. I shouldn't have to say that. But it has been remarkable seeing how many times politicians whose bread and butter it is to support independence do not seem to have focused on those essential points about its appeal to people at large.
I mean, all the more so in the context of a cost of living crisis and the various other sort of economic challenges that are really biting at the moment. And quite often, independence and the economy are presented as sort of a dichotomy. You can aspire to independence, as you said, on a sovereigntist basis, or you can aspire to have a good economy and a healthy economy. I think one of the sort of the gaps potentially is the failure sometimes of politicians to actually make an economic case for independence, to actually highlight the potential differences of what an independent Scottish economy would look like and be sort of fundamentally based on versus the current shape of the UK economy, which must also be a sort of a significant issue in the Welsh independence movement. How often, Hugh, is there this sort of narrative in Wales as well of, you can have independence or you can have an economy, i.e. the UK economy. You can't necessarily have both.
Yeah, I think it was interesting. There was a conference in London this week, and ironically, I think John Swinney was there on the day that Yousaf resigned, and Mark Drakeford was there, the former First Minister, talking about, sort of how devolution has worked. And, Drakeford was making the point that, sort of power should be devolved completely, and then you pool those bits that that need to be back into the centre, which is a nice way of thinking. I think that's what happens in the Basque country. So basically, in the Basque country, they have autonomy over everything apart from I think it's defence and foreign affairs. So those are handled on a national government level. But I think that the reality is, and we forget this all the time, is that United Kingdom, 84% of the population of the United Kingdom are English. That it's what they want and how they want to operate is what's going to go. The fact that to think that they're going to have some sort of democratic, federalised UK where Wales, Northern Ireland, Scotland got an equal voice with England. It's for the birds. They're never going to allow that to happen. And remember, sort of Wales, and I think, this is where, Brexit is used as the example of Scotland didn't vote for it, but Wales did. Remember, Wales has never voted Conservative majority, ever. And I think, that shows you that we in Wales get a government that handles, the big things like the economy that the people of England decide. And that's why, the risk is, we've had 13 years of Conservative government, and we've never voted for it. But I think from an independence perspective, the economic argument is the one. If you go on social media, how are we going to afford it? And we always have this thing, sort of, remember George Thomas, the former Speaker at Westminster, a Labour sort of archetype, Wales going with its begging bowl to Westminster. It's always this sort of that we're reliant on other people, and people ask, well, how would Wales, manage to support itself economically? How could we afford to be independent? Well, so like every other independent country does. It's not like being independent is normal, but it's just this context of what being part of the union. What are the benefits of the union? As far as I can see, there are no benefits to being in the union because what we end up with is Conservative government.
Thank you, Hugh. Well, that's it for this week's Full Scottish. Before I go, I just want to remind you that at Broadcasting Scotland, we depend on the generosity of our supporters. Our programmes will always be free. However, if you can afford £5 per month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. To everyone who's donated, to everyone who's signed up to make a regular monthly payment, thank you very much. Thank you also again to my guests, Professor Murray Pittock and Hugh Marshall. I've been Seán Pieper. Goodbye. Thank you for watching.